Sometimes in your search for happiness, you ponder the meaning of your life.
And what is the truth?
You sift your memory for beginnings.
The truth.
You send your mind ahead for directions.
Truth.
But all you really know is now, and you are lost in the present.
And what is the truth?
Well, now, here's a man who wants to get right down to it. Kind of anxious to get to it, are you? Whatever.
Right, welcome back to the History of Being Human podcast. I'm the host, Noel Armstrong. Continuing and maybe wrapping up our series on some of the dumbest things in history, we'll probably do one more interview relevant to this topic, which I'm very excited about. Then we'll wrap it up, at least for a time. I'm sure we'll come back to it at some point, because that ground is just too rich to leave unplowed. As I talked about in the Vera Tiesler interview, human sacrifice is probably one of the dumbest things in history. There's no causal relationship between cutting off somebody's head and your corn growing, cutting their hearts out and the sun coming up the next day. So human sacrifice is a costly, completely useless, and miserable practice. So of course the question is, why do it? Why do cultures adopt this practice? Well, around the same time I interviewed Dr. Vera Tiesler about Mayan human sacrifice practices, I talked to Dr. Jan Bremer about the same topic. In fact, I was, at the time, thinking about getting together an entire series about human sacrifice, decided against it, but I really appreciate Dr. Bremer's time. He's a fascinating scholar. We talk about a wide range of topics related to human sacrifice, so today, grab a nice cup of postum, if postum even exists anymore, sidle up to the fire and enjoy a pleasant conversation about human sacrifice. I'm speaking with Dr. Jan Bremer. He's the Professor Emeritus of Religious Studies at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. Yeah. Dr. Bremer received his PhD from the Free University with a dissertation called The Early Greek Conception of the Soul. And this is something that doesn't happen to too many people. He publishes his dissertation in 1979. It's picked up and published by the Princeton University Press in 1983, and it's stayed in print ever since. Is that correct?
That's correct.
That's fantastic. His book, The Greek Religion, has also been translated into Dutch, German, Italian, Spanish, French. He is the Chair of Religious Studies at the Faculty of Theology and Religious Studies at the University of Groningen, now emeritus. He's the Dean of the faculty for nearly 10 years. His contributions to the field have been nationally and internationally recognized. He's been a fellow or distinguished professor at the Center for Hellenic Studies in Washington. You've been to Princeton, the University of Christchurch, the Getty Research Institute, in Edinburgh, Cologne, Munich. So you are very well qualified to speak on these topics we're going to discuss today, and I really appreciate you taking the time.
Great.
I looked at your list of publications. It's extensive, and the reason that I reached out to you in specific is because of your work in 2007. You edited a volume called The Strange World of Human Sacrifice.
Yes.
And I'm really trying to understand the motivations behind it, its cultural significance. Why do some cultures practice human sacrifice?
I don't think we really know why some cultures do and others don't. The whole problem of human sacrifice, I think, is pretty baffling. And the only thing we can say is that you can see when, for example, certain cultures practice human sacrifice. But why is really basically impossible to say. Also because we don't have access anymore to cultures who practice human sacrifice.
So are there no practices of human sacrifice today that we know of?
I don't think today, no. And even regarding the cultures in the past, it often was told to us by outsiders, by travelers, for example, who were struck by it. There is really, to the best of my knowledge, I wouldn't know a single example of a culture that itself explained why they practiced human sacrifice.
Really? So this is a little bit like cannibalism. When you wanted to dehumanize a certain population, you threw out the accusation of cannibalism at them. And the same thing might be true for human sacrifice.
Perhaps with the difference that I think we can be pretty sure that some cultures did practice human sacrifice, whereas cannibalism, I think, is still discussed. There too, I think one should be reticent in rejecting the possibility, because it's very clear in times of great emergency, when we have the famous case of the Chilean basketball team that crashed in the Andes and started to eat up some of their dead comrades. So the possibility exists, but the practice, I think, is very hard to trace.
Now, do we know that there are some cultures which it's not very controversial? I'm thinking of like the Aztecs, the Maya, cultures that everyone agrees did practice human sacrifice.
Yes, but even in the case of the Aztecs, I think our most important descriptions come from Spaniards who often were quite a bit away from the actual scene where it happened. But it seems pretty clear also from archaeological findings that the Aztecs, the Maya, and some other South American peoples did practice. Even the Romans, in some extreme moments in time, I think most scholars would agree that they did practice human sacrifice.
I saw an article where the Smithsonian had quoted you regarding the findings of some remains about a Greek skeleton that appears to have been sacrificed ritualistically, and you expressed skepticism. Was there any example that you know of in Greek culture of human sacrifice?
Not really. We have a few anecdotes, but the anecdotes have been pretty convincingly shown to be legendary. And with this one skeleton of the Lycaon in Arcadia, I think one must be always very skeptical with archaeologists, because they need some publicity to whip up, to fund their expeditions. So even there, the fact that a skeleton has some traces of knives on it can be all kind of reasons, I think. Once again, not 100% excluded, but certainly not 100% probable.
It's interesting that you say that, because I was doing a series on some early human ancestors, and paleontologists there would often name them something like Millennium Man, and it seemed to me that it's exactly what you were saying. They were trying to drum up a little publicity.
Times are hard, and if you need money, you'll probably do everything you can.
So some of the reasons that I've seen to explain the practice of human sacrifice, especially ritual human sacrifice, would be enforcing social order. There was work that came out by a man named Joseph Watts. I think he was a PhD candidate in New Zealand, and he spoke about a kind of a class warfare interpretation of ritual human sacrifice. Have you heard this?
Yes, and I must say it's certainly true that even in Greece, which is ancient Greece, the area of which I'm most familiar with, sacrifice serves to delimit social hierarchies. The most important person will get the nicest piece of steak, and the people who don't belong to the club won't get anything. So there's no doubt about it that sacrifice can serve to show who is a member of us, of the insider group, and who is not. But you don't need human sacrifice for that. So I think it's rather shaky to claim that.
Yeah, it's kind of a costly, inefficient way to enforce a social hierarchy, but at least viscerally shocking enough to cow a population, you would think.
Yes, but it's certainly true that in my book I found very few examples where people actually protest against sacrifice. Only in Tahiti, I found some evidence that people started to complain and protest. So I think if it's part of your culture, you accept it. And if it's not part of your culture, you will find it strange, or you will embellish reports and so on.
Now, you've also, I saw, edited some volumes on magic. Has human sacrifice, does it have any magical elements in any of the cultures or societies where it's practiced?
I wouldn't say human sacrifice as such, but it's certainly true that skulls, for example, in Greek and Roman culture, they were used for necromancy, to call up the dead, for example. So it seems to also the case that sometimes you find bones, human bones, which have been used for magic. And people say that this is typical also of this kind of vilifying the other, that people killed small children to practice magic.
What you just described kind of reminds me of the way, even in Christianity, they use the relics of saints, the bones, the skulls, and so forth, to obtain merit or bend the ear of God and get some wish granted.
Yes, certainly in Christianity, but not only in Christianity. Some years ago I was in Turkey, and in Konya, in a sanctuary of the dervishes, there was a little basket which contained the hair of the Prophet Muhammad. So I think it's quite universal, the worship of relics. It's only today, I think, that certainly we don't want to see them anymore. Not so long ago, I was in a Catholic church, and there was a skeleton on display. That doesn't make you feel very happy. I think we are no longer used to those things. But certainly, yes, relics are, I would say, universal.
So, do we have some specific examples of human sacrifice that are unequivocal? For example, I've heard the Vikings, before a battle, would sometimes sacrifice a favorite horse or a child. Is this generally accepted as true, or is that also sensationalized?
I think that's sensationalized, but it's certainly true that the Romans, at the height of their war against the Carthaginians in the Second Punic War, at the end of the 3rd century, they buried alive a Celt and a Greek. So that's a case that seems pretty much accepted among scholars. Much more debated is whether the Carthaginians also sacrificed young children, because we have many examples of graves dug up with bodies of small children which look like having perhaps been sacrificed, the so-called Tophet in Carthage. So it's one of these things, I think, where modern skepticism and, on the other hand, historical evidence, they try to keep one another in balance. But given our absence from the evidence, it's very hard to be certain.
I was under the impression that this idea of the Moloch idol was not controversial. I mean, originally some people had considered it just a propaganda campaign against other Canaanites by the House of Israel. But apparently they've found burial sites with a lot of remains of young children that make it less controversial now, that maybe there was indeed a Moloch idol practice.
Yes, in the case of Moloch, but there's a lot of debate about it. But for example, in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, if you will, we have a case of the king of Moab who sacrifices, if I remember correctly, his eldest son on the walls when he's being besieged. Those things, of course, they are reported by the Jews and not by the Moabites themselves. But that does not seem to me improbable in itself, because it is a very dramatic situation, and it seems to, except for Latin America, which seems to me a separate case, but in a number of cases, it's very clear that human sacrifice is tied to the most dramatic moments in people's history.
You know, it's interesting, too. Sacrifice in general is, I don't know if you'd call it a cultural universal, but just the idea of sacrifice, giving something up that's valuable for the gods. And this is just the most extreme manifestation of it. What is that human instinct? Why do we have this longing or this desire or fear? What does it satisfy for us to sacrifice? If you're just looking at the strict cost-benefit analysis, it seems very costly and pointless.
If you take the prehistory of sacrifice is still also something that's being researched a lot. And I have an article coming out in which I once again try to argue that sacrifice, certainly as we know it from the Greeks, derives eventually from the hunt. It seems very clear that certain elements of sacrifice can only be explained if we look to a prehistory in the hunt. But in the case of the Greek, it's the normal sacrifice. The gods would only get the bones. So the bones, the bad part would go to the gods, and the good part would go to the people, to the humans. So it was not a bad exchange, I would say, for the mortals to let the gods being satisfied with that part of the animal which normally they wouldn't use. Because real hunting people, they would never, for example, break the bones of the victim so as to suck up the marrow. Whereas we know that among the Greeks, we have found sanctuaries a number of broken bones where the marrow clearly has been used, say, for the soup or something like that.
Did the Greeks have a concept of sin that could be
No.
mapped somewhere onto the Israelite concept of sin?
No, they had a concept of asabeia, of, say, lack of awe for the gods. But they were very liberal in many ways. And the concept wasn't really closely circumscribed, which had the advantage that it wouldn't quickly hit you, but it could also, you could be manipulated. So the famous case of Socrates, he clearly was accused of a kind of lack of awe for the gods. But even in the case of Socrates, it's often forgotten that it was quite a close call in the vote. There were 500 Athenians who voted, and if only 35 had voted for Socrates, the man would have ended up in his bed dead instead of having to drink the hemlock.
I was under the impression that Democritus himself was openly atheistic. Is that correct?
What? That democracy?
No, Democritus, the philosopher Democritus, I thought was openly atheistic, and yet he didn't suffer the same fate.
Yes, but that shows how arbitrary the concept in ancient Greece was. You had a philosopher, Diagoras, who for a long time made atheistic observations. Only, apparently, when he started to reveal the secrets of the Eleusinian mysteries, then the Greeks, the Athenians, condemned him to death. But they left him enough time to escape. And even Socrates, if he had wanted to escape, he could easily have escaped. A few people were condemned to death, as far as we know. And say in the 4th century, we have several women who were accused from this kind of sin and of the wrong magic, and they were executed with their family. But in general, I think you can count the victims on the fingers of one hand.
Going back to the human sacrifice, what about this cult of Kali? The sacrifices in India, I suppose, are not controversial, are they?
No. I think most people would agree that the cult of Kali, that comprised human sacrifice as well. Clearly, this was used, for example, in the 19th century by Jules Verne in his famous 80 Days Around the World. They meet the thugs. We still have in English the term thug for, a nasty people, but really the thugs were the followers of Kali.
How were the Kali sacrifices performed? Who was the victim? How was it? Were there priests that would perform them?
There were priests that performed them, but they would they tried to have outsiders as victims. And that is, I think, also very normal of a human sacrifice. It wasn't the case in Tahiti, but in many examples that we know, it's people, they use others who aren't part of the in-group to be sacrificed. So that shows that there's a certain unease about the sacrifice, I think.
I've read several accounts that say that the ancient Hebrews practiced human sacrifice, and then there are others who say that that is not the case. And yet we have these stories in the Old Testament about Jephthah, whose daughter comes back, and he says he's going to sacrifice whoever first appears to the Lord, and he ends up going through with it.
Yes, it's very odd. We have a very similar story in the myths of the ancient Greeks. It's always the only daughter who is the victim. So the case is clearly dramatized. Just like, say, the Gospels, Jesus will resurrect a daughter of a widow or son of a widow who's the only one. So I think in cases like these, this is more for dramatic effect than that we can really say this is historical memory, because the date when the Hebrew Bible was recorded is very much debated among scholars. The more liberal you are, the later you date the dating of the Hebrew Bible, even into, say, the times of Alexander the Great. Usually the more orthodox or the more conservative Israeli you are, you will date it very early. But I think most scholars would be rather skeptic about the historicity of say, the case of Jephthah, or take the case of Abram and Isaac, where it's also said this is not kind of memory to human sacrifice. I think we should look at these stories as kind of powerful dramatic tales, but not like historical anecdotes.
And if they are morality tales, what purpose did they serve? What need did they meet? I mean, why include the story of Abram binding Isaac?
Yes, if we would know that, we would know a lot. But I think in the case of Abraham and Isaac, one could make a case that it shows that you have to be absolutely obedient to Yahweh, even when he asks the most precious possession of you. Because in the end, things will be okay. If I would have to preach a sermon about the passage, that would be my interpretation, I think.
You start hearing that if you're raised in a Christian home. You start hearing that story at a very young age, so you never really grasp how unsettling the whole concept is.
That's absolutely true. I mean, my father was a Protestant pastor, so I know I've heard the story, of course, also many times, even as a young boy. But it's only later, I think, when you get a bit older, that you start to wonder about, what does it mean? Was it a bit cruel of Yahweh to ask this?
Do you think that part of the success of the spread of Christianity was this stunning imagery that a god could be crucified and sacrificed?
I don't think so. It sounds to me very much like the time of around 1900. In the time around 1900, there was great interest in, say, the dying and rising gods. And Jesus was put, for example, by Fraser in his famous The Golden Bough. He was put into that scheme. But I don't really think so. In fact, the cross as the symbol of Christianity is fairly late. You don't hear about it, say, in the first 2 centuries.
Really?
Hardly even in the 3rd century. In the course of the 3rd century, you see it coming that the cross is used, for example, in papyri instead of the name of Christ. The idea of the cross, say, or a crucifix which you hang on the wall, that is fairly late, I think. The early Christians, I think they believed in a kind of close relationship with Christ, but the cross itself, I don't remember as being very important for that. The rise of Christianity, about which I gave my farewell lecture as a professor, is still very, very debated. We have several studies, but it remains a kind of a mystery, to be honest. For the simple reason also is that we hardly have any conversion stories. Nowadays we have lots of people who become Muslim or people who become Mormon or so on. They can be interviewed and there's enough material if you search on the web to find conversion stories or to become a Baptist or whatever. But for early Christianity, there's maybe 10 stories and they're all highly literary. So it's very difficult. But I think that community was very important in a society where there was no safety, no social safety net, where you could be arbitrarily arrested or murdered or whatever. Sense of brotherhood, I think, was very important. And also the fact that the pagan gods in general had a certain distance to their believers. And so in that respect, I think the early Christians, they went for their idea of a God who actually loved them. The fact that he gave his only son, the classic Christian dogma belief, might have played a role, but I don't see that very, very prominent in the texts.
So it wasn't the eschatology that brought people to Christianity so much as the imminence of God.
Yes, I think that was in the 1st century very important. We only have to wait and Christ will come back. But in the course of the 2nd century, they realized that wouldn't happen. And then you get increasing belief in the afterlife, which was not necessary in the 1st century. In the 1st century, there is virtually nothing about heaven and hell. So also in the Gospels, there's really no description of heaven or whatever. It's only in the course of the first centuries that the early Christians start to develop a picture of heaven with its pearly gates and so on.
I'm going to throw something out. I don't know where I heard this, but I wonder what your opinion of it is. That this concept of sacrifice comes from the very human preference. So when we receive a gift ourselves, we appreciate it, we feel moved by that gift if we know it costed the giver something. And so the same concept some people in ancient times or whenever extended to the idea of giving a gift to the gods. So the more costly it was, the more appeasement, the more merit, or whatever it was they were trying to obtain with the gods, they would get. The most costly thing of all would probably be their children. And I've heard that as an explanation for why the Moloch idol was used. Have you heard this explanation? And if you have, what do you think of it?
Yes, I think the idea of reciprocity is extremely important in human life and culture. You know, if I do something nice to you, I expect you to do something nice to me. If you, say, are as rich as Bill Gates, then you expect a present a little bit conform to that wealth. But on the other hand, people aren't stupid. So, for example, the Chinese, when they bury people, they burn money to go to the afterlife, but they don't give real money. So, since it's also the case, I think with sacrifice, people would, in general, they would give certainly sometimes a bull, and in extreme cases a horse, but the normal sacrifice would be a young sheep or a young goat, something which is not that costly. So I think one must be very, very careful one shouldn't underrate people. You know, we all know you give something, you get something back, but you don't overdo it. Most people, at least, not.
It seems there are some zealots out there who are willing to give pretty much everything.
Yes, that's true. You always have zealots. It's like with hermits. You know, you and I might want to be alone for a while, but not lock us up in the desert for 30 years. So there always are what Robin Lane Fox once called the overachievers. That might be in certain historical circumstances the case, but I think mostly people are pretty rational, don't give more than really is required.
One of the reasons that I've thought, and I don't know if it's true or not, but it's just a confusion of cause and effect. So when you live in a time when you don't know why you're failing in war, why your crops are dying, why you're only giving birth to daughters when you wanted sons, or whatever it is these ancient people were seeking, they didn't know the factors that went into success in those categories. So they would just come up with some association. So if one time they'd sacrificed a horse and then won the battle, they thought they needed to do that before every battle. So I don't know if it's just an attempt to create almost like a scientific method, just controlling the wrong variables.
I think that there's a certain truth in that, because we can see that at extremely dramatic moments, people perform human sacrifice. But normally life exists of less dramatic moments. I mean, we have our ups and downs, but not over dramatic. And I think in that respect, there's an enormous cost. Because maybe you sacrifice a child, but you don't know if you will get another one. So one always have to be careful in that respect. You can see that to a certain extent in Greek mythology. In Greek mythology, say, except for perhaps one late example, the people sacrificed to the gods are always girls. They are princesses, Iphigenia, Polyxena, for example, but Iphigenia is perhaps the most famous example. The Greeks, they are waiting with their fleet to sail out to Troy to beat the Trojans. But there is a calm, and the message comes from a seer that the king Agamemnon, he has insulted the goddess Artemis, and only if he sacrifices his daughter, she will lift the calm and give good winds. And that seems to me very typical. You sacrifice something very precious, a princess, but it's not a prince. That would have been just a bit too far. There is a kind of weighing of the costs also in these tales.
And yet they always sacrifice virgins, it seems like, also.
Yes, although I would say that they sacrifice girls. I mean, the virginity of the girls is not stressed in the stories. The Greeks weren't like, they preserved the virginity of their girls, but in the stories it's never a point of interest.
So you're saying that sacrifice in general is limited because its costs are so high, and only in times of extreme duress or social stress of some kind do these sacrifices become more extreme.
Yes, I would say that is true for most of the cultures we know. There are cultures where it seems like the Aztecs and the Maya. The Maya is already more difficult, I think, because we have less real historical information. But with the Aztecs, they seem to have practiced it to an unusual degree. But they were the exceptions to the rule. And so it's not that we should imagine the past being filled with human sacrifices.
What about the Druids and the Wicker Man? Is that also exaggerated, or is that something that's been confirmed?
No, it's not confirmed. The Wicker Man looks a little bit also dramatizing. No, I think it seems that the Druids also sacrificed human people. But once again, it's usually prisoners of war, people from the other. It's not your own people you sacrifice. The enemy knew that to be a prisoner of war could well mean that you would be killed anyway. So I'm not sure that the fact that you would be ritually killed would be really an argument against attacking, say, some of the Gauls.
In China or in Egypt, they would bury courtesans and servants with the pharaoh or the king.
Yeah.
That's a form of human sacrifice, and I guess it has a different significance than what we've been talking about so far.
Yeah, so Egypt and China, certainly the retainers, there you kill people so that they would accompany the emperor or the pharaoh into the afterlife. It's usually, also in my book, it's treated and discussed under the heading of human sacrifice, but it's clearly a different type than sacrificing people at dramatic moments in the existence of a tribe or a people.
Now, do you have any familiarity with these bog people that they have found that many people consider those a form of human sacrifice also?
Yes, I don't have much, but I've seen them. We have several of the bog people also in Holland. And, with modern techniques, they even have been able to reconstruct the faces with the hairstyles and everything. I think that seems to be a case too where people were strangled and then thrown into the marshes. But why? We have no idea.
It could have been criminals.
It could be, but some of them are girls, so I wouldn't immediately. I think there too it could be prisoners of war, slaves. I haven't mentioned it, but slaves would be also an obvious choice if you want to sacrifice someone who doesn't belong to your own group.
Is there evidence that in prehistoric times human sacrifice was practiced that is considered reliable by historians or anthropologists?
I don't think so. I think also that in general human sacrifice is practiced by people who have, so to speak, a surplus of people. I think in very early human history, there were small groups of people. Everyone in a way was needed to survive. So I doubt that they would have taken recourse very quickly to human sacrifice.
And you'd have to have a certain level of social stratification, which
absolutely. Social stratification, but also, of course, power, because you have to be able to harass, because sometimes in the descriptions of the human sacrifice in Tahiti, it's told that the girl submitted without really any struggle, but I'm pretty sure that not every male, probably not even every female, would have submitted without any struggle. So social stratification, I think, but also a good amount of physical force available to the top layer of society.
That's a very good point. It reminds me, I did a series on cannibalism, and another one of my uplifting series topics. I talked about the fact that humans are not a good food source because they're very difficult to control. They don't want to be eaten. And also, it's a very, very, very costly thing to sacrifice for the same reasons, I would think.
Yes. Yeah. No. I would fully agree. Although, of course, if you're dead and eaten, there's not much to struggle against. And it's certainly true that you have these stories of towns besieged where they start to eat people, or there's an excellent book on shipwrecks in the 19th century where, you survive as a group in a sloop or on a raft. But at a given moment, you eat someone, and it's always the youngest person who's being killed to be eaten. To say till most of the 19th century, this was considered, I wouldn't say normal, but acceptable. It's only towards the end of the 19th century, apparently, that sensibilities changed and that people started to charge the survivors with cannibalism.
Yeah, the law of the sea, they called it.
Yes. What else can you do?
Yeah, just getting on a boat was implied consent, I suppose.
Yes. And they would pull straws, but it would always be the youngest one who pulled the shortest straw, not the strongest man, obviously.
It's amazing how that happened every time.
Yes.
So is there any association between cannibalism and human sacrifice? Are there any societies where the human sacrifice victims were then cannibalized that you know of?
No, I don't think so.
Yeah, I can't think of any either. Are there any other topics or points that you think are interesting related to human sacrifice?
It hasn't happened very often, and when it happens at dramatic moments, and the victims are usually people who don't belong to the sacrificing group of people. I think those are three quite trans-cultural and trans-historical aspects of human sacrifice which we'll need to keep in mind.
Yeah, and like you said, I think the Maya might have been somewhat of an exception. I was talking to Dr. Vera Tiesler, who is, she studies Mayans, and she has talked a little bit about sacrifice there. She said that it was actually, after playing their ball game, the Mayan ball game, it was considered, I guess a great honor, something that was reserved for the very special, the pure, the best of the people, to be sacrificed after these ball games.
Yes, it's said indeed that the losers, they would be sacrificed. But I don't know, that content make for a very fair play game, I would have thought. So yeah, certainly we have no information about the victims, whether they consider them an honor too. I think those explanations, one should be extremely doubtful about, because it goes against common sense.
That's true. Anything that seems to defy human nature, we should probably treat with some skepticism.
At least to start with, yes, absolutely, unless there's overwhelming evidence.